How are you? It's Dr. Amoso. Today we want to talk about a slave trade. We want to look on the reasons why slave trade survived for a long period of time after its ban. Remember, slave trade it was banned in 1807 and slavery it was banned in 1933. Despite being banned in 1807, despite slavery being banned in 1933, we see that these activities they still are continued. So we want to look on the reasons that explains why a slave trade and slavery continued being practiced long after these activities were banned in 1807 and also in 1833 respectively. So we discover that Eurocentric historians they blame Africans for the delay in the stopping of slave trade. So the Eurocentric historians they will be saying that Africans were responsible for the continuity of slave trade and slavery. On the other side, the Afrocentric historians would also saying that Eurocentric ideologies, Europeans or the whites were also responsible for the delay of slave trade and slavery. So there is a blame game between the Afrocentric historians and Eurocentric historians on why slave trade continued existing long after it had been banned in 1807 and also in 1933. So let's now look on the internal factors or the local factors that explains why slave trades continued existing. Number one, let's start with too many unwanted people in Africa. Some historians they say that there were so many people in Africa. So because of too many people in Africa now, we see that there was a reason to continue practicing slave trade and also slavery. They said that in Africa there were so many thieves. In Africa there were so many witches. In Africa there were so many so many people who were deviants. So because of that now slave trade it was supposed to continue. Why? It was a way of removing all those people who were not behaving properly in Africa. So it was a way, a reason that had been given to justify why slave trade continued taking place in Africa. Number two, you talk about the chiefs who benefited from these activities of slave trade and slavery. It is said that chiefs benefited from the lucrative trade of slave trade and slavery. They got several items from these activities. They got beads, they also got guns, they also got clothes from the activities of slave trade and slavery. We are given examples of King Gezo of Dahomey. It is said that King Gezo of Dahomey and also King Glele, they got money that was paid through taxes that they were getting from these activities. So we are seeing Glele and also Gezo becoming so wealthy because of the taxes that they were collecting from the activities of slave trade and slavery. And it is also said that King Gezo, he held calabash. Calabash, these were ceremonies, these were celebrations that were done, and celebrations such as these, calabash celebrations such as these, they were done, they were conducted using the monies that he got from activities of slave trade and slavery. So we are seeing that African kingdoms, African chiefs, they benefited from the activities of slave trade and slavery. Number three, we talk about the lack of substitute product. There was a lack in the terms of replacing these activities. They could not replace slave trade and slavery. It was difficult to replace these activities. So here have been challenges, here have been problems in having a substitute product to substitute slave trade and slavery. It explains why it would take long to stop these activities long after these activities were condemned by different people such as humanitarians, and also philanthropists. Number four, we talk also about the presence of cracks and also lagoons. These cracks now, they were common. The lagoons were common and they acted as hideouts. And it is said that each time the British squadron came, the people could hide. The slaves were hidden in these creeks and what lagoons. So by having these creeks and lagoons, we see that activities of slave trade, slavery continued. Why? Because these were used as a hideout. So as they were hiding there, we see that slave trade the activities they were done nicodemously, they were done whilst people were trying by all means to pretend as if nothing was taking place, but in the sense that we in the sense we see the activities of slave trade and slavery what are taking place. Number five, we talk about Africans. The Africans steal the markets for their slaves. Africans still were having markets to sell their slaves. We are told that countries such as Brazil, countries such as France, and also Portugal, they established plantations. So they wanted labor. More labor was wanted at these plantations in Brazil, France, and Portugal. So Africans, they still had markets to sell their slaves. So when these markets still continue to exist now, it meant that they continued practicing slave trade and slavery long after these activities were condemned or they were banned. Number six, you talk about West African coastline. It was too wide to be supervised by one squadron. So the coastline, it was too wide. It was too wide. It was impossible for it to be supervised by one squadron. So that on its own, it became difficult. It was so difficult to stop slave trade. One, because of the vastness of the coastline. So the vastness of the coastline now it became it was now a hindrance in stopping slave trade. Why? Because some activities of slave trade and slavery still continued being done. Supervision was a challenge or it was a problem. So these were the local factors that explains why it did take so long for activities of slave trade and slavery to stop. Although these activities were condemned, but still these activities were done. Let's look on the external factors. Number one, let's talk about many European countries yet not industrialized. Industrialization, it was started in Britain, but so many countries yet not industrialized like what Britain had done. So it was difficult for slave trade and slavery not to continue. Why? Because these countries still were benefiting economically from the activities of slave trade and slavery. Number two, European powers they were suspicious of British what intentions in stopping a slave trade. They were suspicious. Why is it that Britain wants to stop these activities? Why is Britain interested in abandoning these activities? So they were not clear on the intentions of Britain. They were suspicious on the intentions of Britain. So that on its own explains again why activities of slave trade and slavery continued long after these activities had been banned. Number three, we talk about Brazil yet established sugar plantations. Like what we've said, it was not only Brazil but France and Portugal. They had several sugar plantations. So they wanted as many slaves as possible. So Africans had to provide these slaves. Africans had to provide labor. So despite banning slave trade and slavery 1907, 1933 respectively, but still labor was wanted in Brazil, Portugal, and also France. So by so doing now, slave trade continued taking place. Then number four, you talk about some European countries. They signed anti-slave trade treaties reluctantly. They reluctantly signed the anti-slave trade. So they floated the laws of stopping slave trade and slavery. So the laws now were floated by European powers. Yes, they signed, 2023 signing, but now in their hands they were saying we are signing, but we are going to continue with activities of slave trade and slavery. So by so doing, we are seeing that the activities of slave trade are continued. Then the last one, now we talk about Britain. It only one squadron to supervise the war coastline. So there was only one squadron that was supposed to supervise the war coastline. It was impossible to effectively stop the activities of slave trade and slavery. Why? Because of the wideness, because of the vastness of the coastline. So slave trade could not stop, and that on its own, it explains why slave trade activities still are continued. So these are the local factors, the internal factors, these are the external factors that explains why slave trade and slavery continued long after these activities had been banned in 1807 and also in 1933. Let's look on the practice questions. Which question comes on these aspects of slave trade and slavery? Number one, why did slave trade continue long after its ban? 25 marks. Why did slave trade continue long after its ban? 25 marks. Number two, internal factors were responsible for the delay in ending slave trade. Internal factors were responsible for the delay in ending slave trade. That is the question. How accurate is this assertion at 25 marks? So these are the practice questions that we can use on this topic. Thank you so much. It's Dr. Mosso.